The evidence for the resurrection is compelling. It consists of two main elements, the empty tomb and the testimony of eyewitnesses. And this evidence is so compelling that skeptics have had to come up with new arguments to diminish it. In this video, we're going to look at these new arguments and see how they fail to undermine the truth of the resurrection. So, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the like button, and off we go. The resurrection starts off with the fact that Jesus was killed by crucifixion, and there's lots of evidence for that. It's agreed by all sorts of ancient sources, by Christian sources, of course, but also by Jewish sources and by Roman sources. It's even agreed by modern people. It's agreed by modern Jewish scholars, by modern Christian scholars, of course, and even by modern atheist and critical scholars. Everyone agrees Jesus was killed by crucifixion, but on the third day after that, he rose from the dead. How do we know he rose from the dead? Well, there are two pieces of evidence. The first one is that Jesus' tomb was empty at the end of the day of the resurrection and thereafter. And one of the reasons that we know that is that the authorities could have stopped Christianity. They tried very hard to stop Jesus. They could have stopped his followers by producing the body, but they didn't do that. They couldn't do it. The other piece of evidence is that there were many witnesses who saw Jesus alive after the resurrection. Several hundred witnesses, in fact. 1 Corinthians 15 gives a list, but there are others who aren't in this list in Corinthians. And it includes all sorts of different people. It includes people who are relatives of Jesus. They wouldn't recognize Jesus. They would know it was him. Disciples of Jesus who'd been very close to him, again, would know it was him. But it includes skeptical people. It includes at least one very firm opponent to Christianity. And yet they all said they saw Jesus alive after the resurrection. Just go over that evidence a bit more. The physical evidence, the empty tomb. The obvious thing is that the authorities could have stopped Christianity very quickly, but they didn't because they couldn't produce the body of Jesus. But there is more evidence in the way that the people in Jerusalem talked about it, or the authorities in Jerusalem talked about it. And this is a passage from the Gospel of Matthew, where the priests, the authorities, tell the guards on the tomb to say that the disciples came and stole the body from the tomb. Not a particularly good story, but it's a story that was repeated, and it ends up saying this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. Now, that would have been really easy for the first readers of Matthew to check. All they had to do was to find a knowledgeable Jewish person and ask them what happened to the body of Jesus, and they would say, it was stolen by the disciples. So we can be fairly certain that the tomb was empty. It's a bit like the excuse you might get. Small boy goes to school and tells the teacher, the dog ate my homework. Well, not a very good excuse. You might not believe in the dog, but you certainly can believe that there is no homework. Same thing here. You'd have to believe that the tomb was empty, because why make up a story like that if there's a body in the tomb? And this story of a stolen body was being repeated in the middle of the 2nd century, and we have two ancient witnesses who show that it still was being repeated by people of a Jewish persuasion at that time. The other evidence, the human witnesses, and 1 Corinthians 15 gives a list of just some of these. It doesn't do them all, but it gives some in the list. It talks about Peter, the apostle, also known as Cephas. It talks about 500 at once. It talks about the apostle Paul. Now that list We can date it very precisely. It's written in 55 AD between Passover and Pentecost. But the Apostle Paul says, this isn't my list. This is a list that was handed down to me. It's something he received earlier on from the apostles. So the previous time he'd seen the apostles was in 48 AD, at the Council of Jerusalem, and it might not have been on that occasion. It might have been on an even earlier occasion, and people have speculated that it could have been as soon as only perhaps 5 or 6 years after the resurrection. But how early it is isn't important, it's how accurate it is. Paul, of course, is a first-hand witness. He's writing the letter himself, and he's saying, I saw Jesus. The others, he's saying, well, they saw Jesus, they told me about it. It's interesting to think about the 500, he calls them brothers, so maybe there were women there as well, but there were 500 and more men who saw it. Now, we can track down when that occasion probably was, and it's probably on a mountain in Galilee, reported in Matthew. And what does Jesus say to the disciples? Well, he says, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So he tells them to go out and talk about the resurrection. Go and make disciples of all nations. Paul says of these 500 brothers, some of them have died, but most of them are still alive. That's a curious thing to say, except in one circumstance, and that is so you can ask those people what they saw. Now, these are Galileans, they're in Galilee. Corinth is a long way from Galilee, and there's no particular reason for someone from Corinth to go to Galilee. So it's unlikely that people from Corinth went and found these 500 people in Galilee. So what's happening? Well, these 500 people are traveling around, they're going quite a long way, and talking about what they saw of the resurrection of Jesus. Interestingly, that's exactly what Jesus told them to do. So we've got two little details, something we can deduce, this going around the world talking about the resurrection. We can deduce it. We can deduce it from two different texts. Neither of them puts out as a major point. It's just there you can deduce it. And they're two completely unconnected texts. Different people wrote them at different times for different purposes. So we've got strong corroboration that these 500 witnesses existed and were going around telling people about the resurrection. There are other witnesses as well who aren't in 1 Corinthians 15. There's a gospel written by Matthew, disciple of Jesus, another gospel written by John. Mark, well, he wasn't an apostle. He wasn't one of Jesus's close disciples, but he was the son of the people who own the upper room where the Last Supper took place and where at least one of the appearances of Jesus after resurrection took place. So if he wasn't an eyewitness himself, and he might very well have been there when Jesus appears, if he was an eyewitness, he was very close to eyewitnesses. And the other one is Judas, the brother of Jesus, not Judas Iscariot, different Judas. Judas writes the letter of Jude in at the end of the New Testament. And again, he's a brother of Jesus, but someone who wasn't really a follower of Jesus while Jesus was teaching before his crucifixion. So we have a lot of witnesses, and the witnesses didn't have an easy time. They didn't gain anything by giving evidence. In fact, they suffered persecution because of their evidence. So we have no reason to doubt their evidence. Think about the evidence. We've got two kinds of evidence. You want evidence that I got up, I'm not in bed now. Well, there's two bits of evidence you can think of. One of them is that if you look over at the right-hand side of the screen, you can see me there talking to you, and I'm not in bed. The other one, that's like the witness evidence. The other one, physical evidence, you go and look at my bed, and you'll see I'm not in it. So for the resurrection, we have all the evidence there is. We have physical evidence, and we have witness evidence. The only two kinds of evidence you can have. And it's there, and it talks about the resurrection. So there's only one conclusion that fits that evidence. People have tried to find other conclusions, but none of them fit. The only conclusion that fits the evidence is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. None of the other theories fits that. So how, if I'm going to be a real skeptic, how am I going to get round that? Well, what the skeptics do is they try to dispose of the evidence. So what do you think of what I've said so far, the evidence we've presented? Is it compelling? Let us know what you think in the comments. Let's look at the way that more recent people have tried to challenge the evidence. So the first one is to say that, well, there are no reports from eyewitnesses, it's just hearsay. Well, remember 1 Corinthians 15, it's got a list of eyewitnesses in it. It has people who knew Jesus, it has an opponent, it has a skeptic, it has 500 plus other eyewitnesses. It has a huge number of eyewitnesses to Jesus, and that is written very close to the time of the resurrection. And the 500 plus eyewitnesses is underwritten by an undesigned coincidence, this minor agreement, something you can deduce from that and from other accounts, which tells you that the evidence. So that's written quite close to the resurrection, within 25 years. The evidence does exist. There is report from witnesses. And it's at a time when the apostles, the people who were the followers of Jesus, are still alive. These are people who knew Jesus, who'd heard him teach, and are acting as witnesses to what he said. So we've got all the evidence that you could think of, and this list of eyewitnesses is a very solid list of witnesses indeed. Another one that people bring up is the idea, well, the Gospels were written very late, they say, so the evidence, it must be tainted by the time that it was written down. Let's think about how the dates go. There's it starts off with the resurrection of Jesus, which might have happened in 30 AD, or it might have happened in 33 AD, the two possible years. I tend to the 30 AD view, but lots of people think 33 AD. We'll take the 30 AD because that makes the case more difficult from my point of view. Two significant events that happen later on. There's a fire in Rome and Nero begins to persecute Christians, and there's a war between the Romans and the Jews, a sort of revolt, which in the end is put down. That lasts from 66 AD to 74 AD, with the temple in Jerusalem, in fact the whole of Jerusalem, being destroyed in 70 AD. I'm going to say that the New Testament's finished by that time. It's written, possibly not the Revelation, but the rest of it is written by that time. Think how long life witnesses would last. Supposing that you've got someone who's 30 in 30 AD, makes the sums a bit easier. He'd be 70 in 70 AD. Some people could be younger, they'd be even younger than that. Well, ancient times, some people would start dying off at a quite young age, but others still lived as long as people do nowadays. The Apostle John, we know, lived into the reign of Trajan, which is right at the end of the first century. It starts right at the end of the first century, so he's living on into the 90s. He's probably about 20 at the time of the resurrection. But while some would die by the time Nero's persecution began, a lot of them would still be alive. And you only need some of them to produce evidence. The first piece of writing in the New Testament was probably the letter of Paul to the Galatians. That's written in, we know exactly when it's written, or very close. It's written in the year 48, and it's written between Passover. Sorry, we don't know exactly that point. It's written early on in that year. And the first verse of that letter, which is therefore the first verse of the New Testament to be written down is Paul an apostle, not from men or through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him, that's Jesus, from the dead. So the first verse of the New Testament to be written down mentions the resurrection of Jesus. 1 Corinthians, that's the one that's more precise in its dating. We know it was written between Passover and Pentecost, 55 AD, so late spring. And that has this list of Peter, Paul, James, the brother of Jesus, all the apostles. It says the 12, the committee of Jesus' closest disciples, and this more than 500 other eyewitnesses. He said all these people saw Jesus alive after the resurrection. So again, this is well within living memory. Paul mentions that of the 500, some of them have died, but most of them are still alive, and that will be true of eyewitnesses in general to the resurrection. So we have evidence outside the Gospels, which comes from, well, if Jesus was crucified in 30 AD, we've got 18 years after the event, first thing written. We've got a list of witnesses written 25 years after the resurrection. And we can go on to the Gospels. The Gospel of Mark is alluded to in 1 Corinthians. So it's written before 55 AD. It's probably written after 50 AD. Can't be certain, but seems very likely. So somewhere in that period, we have Mark writing his account. Now, we've got Luke as well. Luke is writing before Acts. Acts is written at the very earliest possible time in 62 AD. So as Luke is before that, it must be 61 AD, and it's probably written between 57 and 61 because Luke goes and visits Jerusalem and then other parts of Judea and Galilee. From 57 onwards, he's got 2 years in which he can collect information and then write it down as a gospel. So somewhere in that period, I tend to think probably after 60 AD, but somewhere in that period, Luke writes his account. Again, accounts of the resurrection of Jesus, accounts of people seeing Jesus alive after he was raised from the dead. John's Gospel is a bit later, but you can fit it nicely into 65 or 66 AD. Again, John says he was there at the crucifixion. John saw the risen Jesus, and he writes an account which is there because he's a witness. Matthew is the hardest one to date. We know it's written before 70 AD. Very difficult to say how early it's written. I tend to think it's written probably after 60 AD, but other people can put it quite a lot earlier. Some people put it very close to the crucifixion. I'm not going to go for that. I'm going to go a bit later. But the point is, all these are well within living memory. These are people writing a gospel who can, well, some of them were eyewitnesses, some of them could talk to eyewitnesses, and they could be certain to get right exactly what happened. So we don't have to worry about the Gospels being inaccurate. The Gospels are written by either eyewitnesses or people with access to eyewitnesses, and they're written quite close to the time of the resurrection of Jesus. What else? Well, another one that's raised a lot is the ending of Mark's Gospel. And the idea is that the last 12 verses of Mark might not be part of Mark's actual writing. And that's a general view of many scholars, not one I agree with, but it's a view of many textual scholars, based mainly on the fact that there's a change of style. So the last 12 verses of Mark are in a different style than the first 12 verses the first 8 verses of the same chapter. I think I can find reasons for that, which has nothing to do with the idea that it's a late addition. These are the list of resurrection appearances, the only list of resurrection appearances in Mark. And as Mark is the earliest gospel, the critics say, or the skeptics say, this is something that was only known later on. They say the resurrection wasn't known until after Mark's gospel had been written, and it's the earliest gospel, so it's something that appears later on with a later gospel. Well, that argument doesn't hold water. That's the problem. I said there are actually some quite good reasons to consider those verses authentic. They appear in nearly every manuscript of the Gospel of Mark. It's just the ones from Alexandria, and not all those even, that show that miss those verses out. Now, those do list the resurrection appearances, but the Gospel of Mark actually talks about the resurrection of Jesus in other places that aren't in those 12 verses. So Mark knew about the resurrection of Jesus. He's not making it up, having it added later. He knew about the resurrection of Jesus. He knew about the empty tomb. He recounts the women going to the tomb and finding it empty. And he mentions the resurrection, at least those 3 verses earlier on in his gospel. So Mark doesn't say there wasn't a resurrection. Even if those 12 verses aren't there, he's still mentioned it 3 more times elsewhere in his gospel. And of course, we actually have an earlier witness that mentions the resurrection, and we've got a list of people who saw Jesus in 1 Corinthians, which is not written very long after the Gospel of Mark. If you take the skeptics dating and put Mark rather later, then 1 Corinthians is actually before the Gospel of Mark. Again, I think it's just after, but whether it is or not is unimportant. The point is, 1 Corinthians gives a list of witnesses no more than 25 years after the event. Last challenge that has appeared lately is the idea that the gospel accounts of the resurrection just don't fit together, that they contradict one another. And there's a challenge that's been issued by some atheists, which is put together the events of the day of resurrection and fit them all in to make a consistent account that doesn't contradict and doesn't miss anything out. Well, it's difficult to do that because there are lots of different people. There are groups who move around, they break up, they reform, they don't all start in the same place. So it can be quite difficult. They claim that those contradict one another, but actually, if you work out what happened, and I'll put a link in which shows you a video that puts all that together, you can see that actually these accounts fit together very well indeed. They form one harmonious account, but it's something that obviously they didn't collude on. It's something where they wrote different accounts and made it difficult to put them together. So when that happens, it suggests that what you've got is something that is very much a individual picture of something that actually happened. So it's a strong witness to the reliability of the gospel accounts. The gospel accounts of the day of the resurrection fit together so well that they have to be an accurate account from different points of view. So the challenges all fail. The ones that say that, well, they're not really reports from eyewitnesses. The accounts show evidence of reliability, and they show evidence of being accounts from eyewitnesses. The Gospels are written well within living memory, and there are other bits of evidence as well, which we know were written within living memory, but aren't in the Gospels. Mark reports the resurrection of Jesus outside this ending. So we know that he talked about the resurrection, and the resurrection accounts, yes, there are different accounts, but they fit together very well, although it's quite difficult to work out exactly what the sequence was from them. If you do the work, and it'll take you a couple of months, then maybe longer, then those accounts fit together very well. The evidence we've got is sound evidence, and the evidence is very strong, so strong that people have to try and undermine it, because once you admit the evidence, you have to admit the resurrection. Jesus Christ really did rise from the dead. The next question is, what are you going to do about it? Well, the first important thing is to acknowledge that Jesus actually is who he says he is. He's the Messiah. He's the coming ruler of the world. He is Lord. And then when you've understood the gospel, go and get baptized and follow Jesus, because that's the most important thing you can do in your life. Well, I hope you liked that video. If you did like that video, please click on the like button. If you didn't, write in the comments and tell us why. If you did, write in the comments. We've got a website. Look at that. Look out for other videos on the channel. Subscribe if you want more videos like this one. And look out for other videos that are on the topics that I raised in this particular video. And may God bless you always.